It was a moment that no one saw coming. A woman stood in a crowded room, trying to navigate her way through a sea of faces. She was just like everyone else, hoping for a simple day, a smooth experience. But what happened next, in an instant, changed everything. Laughter rang out. Cruel, mocking, and harsh. The kind of laughter that makes your stomach drop and your heart race. It was aimed at her. Not for what she said, not for anything she did, but simply because of the color of her skin. In that moment, the room seemed to close in on her, the eyes of the crowd growing more intense with each passing second. Her skin, her very identity, had become the punchline of a cruel joke. But what happened next will leave you speechless. What most people expected was for her to break, to become angry or embarrassed. After all, this kind of humiliation can crush even the strongest of spirits. Yet, instead of shrinking back or walking away, she did something that no one anticipated. Something so powerful, it turned the situation on its head. She didn't scream, she didn't lash out. No, her response was something that left everyone stunned, even the ones who had laughed at her. As the room fell silent, eyes locked on her, her calm and confident demeanor began to shift the energy. They expected her to falter, to show the cracks in her armor. But what they didn't know was that her strength wasn't in reacting the way they wanted, but in something far more unexpected. With every second that passed, the tension in the room built. Was she going to confront them? Walk away? Or was she going to do something that would leave them all questioning their own actions? And then it happened. What she did next was nothing short of shocking. A move that not only changed the course of that moment, but could change everything about how we look at strength, resilience, and the power of turning the tables in the most unexpected ways. But to find out exactly what happened, you'll need to stick around. Because the next part of the story will leave you thinking about it long after the video ends. It's a story that challenges everything we think we know about standing up for ourselves and using our voice. What happened that day was more than just an act of defiance, it was a statement that rippled through everyone who witnessed it, and beyond. Stay tuned, because the next chapter is one you won't want to miss. The laughter still echoed in her ears. It wasn't something she could just shake off. The sting of it, the humiliation, had settled in deep, burrowing under her skin. But she refused to let it define her. She knew deep down that this moment wasn't the end. It was a turning point, a moment that could either break her or fuel something greater. The eyes on her, those judgmental, disbelieving eyes, had been waiting for her to crumble. They wanted to see her fall, to show that their mockery had power. But she didn't give them that satisfaction. Before this moment, before she had walked into the room full of strangers, she had always been the kind of person who chose to blend in. She kept her head down, her thoughts quiet, her presence unassuming. She knew the world didn't always make room for people like her, for people who didn't fit into the neat boxes society liked to create. It wasn't about being weak, it was about survival. You learn to navigate the world when you understand that not everyone around you has good intentions. Sometimes it feels safer to stay small, to go unnoticed, to slip through the cracks. After all, it's easier to avoid confrontation than to face it head on. But that day, something changed. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of too many small, daily injustices. Maybe it was the quiet build-up of all the times her presence was ignored, dismissed, or ridiculed. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because she had finally realized that no matter how quietly she lived her life, people were still going to find a reason to look down on her. To mock her. To laugh. The laughter in that room wasn't just about her. It was about everything she represented to the people who thought they were better. It was about the color of her skin, the shape of her features, the very essence of who she was. In that room, she wasn't a person. They didn't see her as someone with dreams, fears, talents, or a life story. To them, she was just an object. A target for their cruelty. But that's the thing about cruelty, it thrives when it's unchallenged. When it's allowed to fester in silence. The moment someone stands up to it, it begins to lose its power. And that's exactly what she was planning to do. Her heart beat in her chest as she stood there, under the weight of their gazes. She could feel the pressure, the tension, building with every passing second. They were all waiting for her to break. To cry, to shout, to cower. But that wasn't going to happen. No, she had something else in mind. Something that would turn tables, make them rethink everything they thought they knew about her. Her mind raced as she thought about her next move. What could she do to change the narrative? To show them that they couldn't get away with this? She knew that reacting with anger or bitterness wouldn't work. It would only reinforce the idea that they had power over her. No, she needed to take control in a way that none of them would expect. In a way that would force them to confront their own behavior. Her eyes scanned the room. The people who had laughed were still staring, some of them unsure of what was going to happen next. She noticed a few familiar faces, people who had seen her before but never really paid attention. They thought they knew her. They thought they understood who she was, what she was capable of. But they had no idea. She took a deep breath, gathering strength that had been building up inside her. It wasn't something she had consciously cultivated, it was just there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It had always been there, in quiet parts of her life, in the moments when no one was watching. She had learned to carry herself with a quiet confidence, a steady determination that no one could shake. And now, that quiet confidence was going to be her weapon. The laughter died down, but the tension in the room only grew. She could feel their eyes on her, wondering what she was going to do. Would she cry? Would she lash out? Would she walk away defeated? Instead, she did something that left them all stunned. She smiled. It wasn't a forced smile. It wasn't a smile of submission or defeat. It was a smile that came from deep within her, one that carried the weight of every single moment of strength she had ever had. The kind of smile that said, "You may think you've won, but you haven't even begun to understand who I am." She stood there, tall and composed, as the room fell into an uneasy silence. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The people who had laughed began to look around at each other, unsure of how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others glanced down, avoiding her gaze. It was clear whatever they had expected, this was not it. But her smile wasn't enough to fully disarm the situation. They were still waiting for her to say something. They still wanted a response. They wanted her to acknowledge their cruelty, to give it weight, to make it real. But she wasn't going to do that. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had affected her. She remained silent, letting the stillness hang in the air. The longer she stood there without saying a word, the more the power began to shift. The people who had mocked her were starting to feel the discomfort. The silence was like a weight, pressing down on them, and with each passing second, they were the ones who felt exposed. It wasn't her anymore. It was them. They were the ones who had done something wrong, and now they had to sit with it. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and she could feel it in her bones. She knew this moment wasn't over. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. But what exactly was it? What was her plan? What was she trying to accomplish by standing there, silent and unyielding? She didn't know. Not exactly. But she felt it in her gut. This was her time. This was her chance to shift the narrative, to take back control of a situation that was never hers to lose in the first place. She wasn't just going to be a victim of their mockery. She was going to make them see her as something else entirely. Something stronger. Something unshakable. The room was still, except for the faint sound of shifting feet, the soft murmur of voices as people exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear she had them on edge. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. There was something she still needed to do, something that would finally make them see her for who she truly was. But what was it? The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with unspoken words. She could feel their eyes curious, judgmental, uncertain, scrutinizing her every move. But she was still standing there, unshaken, with a quiet confidence that only seemed to make the silence more intense. What was she waiting for? What was her plan? It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything to them. In truth, she wasn't sure what her goal was anymore, but she knew that leaving this moment unresolved wouldn't be enough. It wasn't just about surviving their laughter, it was about reclaiming something far more important, her voice. They had tried to strip her of it, reduce her to a caricature of her skin and her identity, but she wasn't going to let them. Not anymore. The laughter still echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of how quickly the world could turn on her. She had spent years trying to avoid these kinds of confrontations, trying to keep her head down and her interactions as smooth as possible. But each time, it was the same. People like her were easy targets. It wasn't even a conscious choice for them, it was just how they saw her. She wasn't someone worth taking seriously, someone who deserved respect or kindness. In their eyes, she was the punchline of a joke that wasn't even funny, but one they felt entitled to laugh at anyway. Her eyes flicked over the crowd again, this time searching for something, or rather someone, familiar. In the far corner, she spotted a few faces she had seen before, familiar strangers who had quietly observed, never participating in the cruelty, but never intervening either. The bystanders. They were just as guilty as the ones who had laughed. After all, silence was complicity. She knew it all too well. How many times had she silently stood by as others faced ridicule? How many times had she thought to herself, "It's not my fight." But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't going to stand by and let the moment slip away. She wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. As the seconds stretched on, she felt the pressure mounting. The tension was palpable, like everyone was waiting for her to break, to do something. Anything. It was like a game to them. How far could they push her before she crumbled? The only problem was, she wasn't interested in playing by their rules. From the side of the room, one of the people who had laughed earlier took a step forward, a nervous shift in posture. She could see the uncertainty in their face, the way they were beginning to regret their actions. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And that's when she realized this wasn't just about making them feel uncomfortable in this moment. It was about making them think. About forcing them to reckon with the kind of world they were contributing to. The kind of world where people like her were always the target. For the first time, she let her gaze wander around the room. It wasn't just the people who had laughed that needed to be held accountable. It was everyone else, too. The people who had seen the cruelty and said nothing. The ones who had stood by, their discomfort invisible, but their indifference just as damaging. She could feel the eyes of the bystanders on her, their guilt hanging in the air like a fog. This wasn't just about individual actions. It was about a culture of silence, of turning a blind eye, of pretending that things were fine when they weren't. And then, something else clicked into place. It wasn't just their laughter that had hurt her, it was their belief that they could laugh in the first place. Their assumption that they had the right to mock her for something as simple and as fundamental as the color of her skin. It was a belief that had been ingrained in society for far too long, a belief that still shaped the way people treated each other. And that was the real fight. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been laughed at, ridiculed, or dismissed because of who they were. She was fighting for the people who had been silenced for too long, who had been told that their voices didn't matter, that their existence wasn't worthy of respect. This wasn't just her moment of defiance, it was the moment for everyone who had ever felt small. The quiet confidence that had begun to rise in her now took a different form. It wasn't just about standing tall in the face of mockery, it was about making a statement. About reclaiming the space that was rightfully hers, and forcing everyone to listen. To hear her. To see her. And in that moment, it wasn't just about the people in the room. It was about the millions of others who had faced the same kind of laughter, the same kind of cruelty. She knew that if she didn't speak up now, if she didn't make this moment count, nothing would change. People like her would continue to be treated as jokes, as targets. She couldn't allow that. Not anymore. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision. The decision to speak up. To take control of the narrative. To refuse to let their laughter be the last word. She took a deep breath, and for the first time, she opened her mouth. "Do you think your laughter makes me feel small?" Her voice was steady, calm. But there was a strength in it, an undercurrent that none of them could ignore. "Do you think you can make me question who I am with your words? With your laughter? Because if that's what you think, you're wrong." The room went still. For a moment, no one moved. The tension that had been building now surged to a breaking point, but no one knew how to respond. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had laughed. "You're so used to seeing people like me as less than, as an object to be ridiculed. But let me tell you something you've misunderstood. You've misunderstood me, and you've misunderstood the power of your words." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and the crowd shifted uncomfortably. She could see the doubt beginning to creep in, the cracks forming in their once confident expressions. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her to speak back. To stand up and claim her power in the face of their cruelty. But there was still something in the room that felt unresolved, like the tension hadn't fully broken yet. They were still staring at her, still trying to figure out what to make of her. She hadn't answered the questions they had in their minds. She hadn't given them what they wanted. And that was exactly the point. She wasn't here to give them anything. Not anymore. But what would she do next? The air was thick with the weight of that question. The room felt as though it was holding its breath, suspended in that moment of uneasy silence. Every pair of eyes was locked on her, each person trying to figure out what came next. Her words had landed, but they hadn't fully sunk in yet. They weren't sure how to respond. Should they apologize? Should they pretend nothing had happened? Should they laugh it off again, as if this was all some joke? But this wasn't a joke. And she wasn't playing by their rules anymore. Her heart pounded in her chest, the pressure mounting with every passing second. She had spoken out, broken the silence, but the tension wasn't gone. Far from it. Now, there was something more at play, something bigger. Something they weren't prepared for. The people who had laughed, the bystanders who had stood in silence, they were all beginning to realize that this wasn't about a simple moment of ridicule. This was about something deeper. Something that would leave them questioning their own actions, their own beliefs, long after they walked away. But that realization wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for her to just make them feel uncomfortable. She needed more. She needed them to understand. She needed them to see the pain that lay beneath their laughter, the years of silent suffering that so many like her had endured. She couldn't let this be just another moment to let slip by. She couldn't afford to be passive anymore. And yet, as the seconds stretched on, she felt herself growing uncertain. Not of what she had to say, she knew that was right, but of how far she could push them. How far she could push herself. She had always been the one who stayed quiet, the one who avoided conflict. But now she was in the thick of it, standing tall in front of them, knowing she couldn't back down. The room was closing in, and for a fleeting moment, doubt began to creep in. What if they didn't understand? What if her words fell flat? What if they laughed again, even harder this time, trying to strip her of the power she had just claimed? But then, something inside her shifted. She couldn't go back. She couldn't unspeak the words she had just said. And the truth was, she didn't want to. She wasn't going to shrink. Not now. Not ever again. Her voice broke the silence again, steady and strong, though the tension in the room felt like it could shatter anything. You think I'm the joke? You think I'm the one who's wrong here? She paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air. I'm not the one who has to answer for this. You are. And there it was. The turning point. The moment when the full weight of the room shifted. Her words were no longer just about her, they were a mirror held up to each and every person in that room. A mirror that reflected their own complicity, their own participation in a system that had allowed this cruelty to go unchallenged. But still, there was a sense of hesitation. The laughter had died, but the unease had only intensified. No one was laughing now, but no one knew what to do next. It was as though they were waiting for permission to react, to decide whether this was something they could ignore, or whether it was something they had to confront head-on. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the faces of the crowd. I don't need your apologies, she said, her voice carrying a quiet power that seemed to reverberate off the walls. I don't need your pity either. But what I do need is for you to realize that your actions have consequences. That your words matter. That your silence matters. The room was so still now that she could hear her own heartbeat, the tension so thick it felt almost suffocating. She could see the people around her shifting, some uncomfortable, some defensive, others avoiding her gaze altogether. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but it didn't touch her. Not anymore. And then, she noticed something. One person in the back of the room, someone who had been watching quietly, was beginning to stir. She couldn't tell what was happening inside them, but something in their body language told her they were different from the others. Their posture was changing, their eyes moving away from the floor, starting to lock onto her. They were beginning to shift in their seat, a subtle but unmistakable sign that they were listening. Really listening. That moment gave her a surge of hope. Maybe this wasn't all for nothing. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone here who could see beyond the moment of laughter, beyond the tension, and understand the deeper truths she was trying to convey. But the clock was ticking. Time was running out. The longer the silence stretched on, the more likely it was that someone would break it. That someone would speak, either to dismiss her again or to brush it all off as some overblown issue. It was what people did, after all. They deflect, they minimize, they ignore. It was a pattern she had seen too many times before. She couldn't let that happen. Not now. Look at me, she said, her voice calm but unwavering, directed at the person who seemed to be watching her more intently than the others. Look at me, and tell me that this doesn't matter. Tell me that you can walk away from here and not change the way you think about everything. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, eyes darting between her and the person in the back. It was as though the room had become a pressure cooker, and she was the one holding the valve that would release the tension. Would this person speak? Would they rise to the challenge, or would they retreat into the safety of their indifference? And still, no one said anything. The silence was deafening. Her words were out there, raw and unguarded, waiting to be either accepted or dismissed. But the silence stretched on, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Everyone knew that something had changed, but no one knew what would happen next. Would this be the breaking point, the moment when the world around her shifted? Or would the tension explode in a different direction, leaving her still fighting for her voice, still pushing for the truth to be heard? One thing was certain, this was the moment that everything hinged on. The air crackled with anticipation. The room was on the edge of something, but what? The seconds dragged on, stretching into what felt like an eternity. The room was taut with anticipation, each person waiting for something to break the stillness. Her gaze remained fixed on the person who had been watching her, and for a moment, she thought she saw something shift, something resembling acknowledgement, or maybe even regret flickering behind their eyes. But then, just as she was about to speak again, something unexpected happened. The door to the room opened, cutting through the tension like a knife. Everyone's eyes snapped toward the new arrival. A tall figure stepped inside, their presence immediately commanding attention. At first, it seemed like a simple interruption, but the sudden change in atmosphere told a different story. It wasn't just anyone who had entered, it was someone who held a certain weight, a certain authority. The figure paused at the doorway, scanning the room before their gaze landed on her. There was a fleeting moment of recognition in their eyes, but it was quickly masked by a cold, professional demeanor. "Is everything all right in here?" The voice was smooth, controlled, so different from the raw emotions that had filled the room just moments before. Her stomach twisted. It was the last person she had expected to show up. The one person who had never once stood up for her, never once challenged the people who had ridiculed her over the years. Someone who had been just as complicit in the system that allowed these things to happen. But this wasn't the time for personal history. Not now. The stakes had just been raised, and she couldn't let this new presence derail everything she had fought for in this room. The tension thickened. The newcomer's eyes swept over the room, taking in the faces of those who had laughed, those who had stood by, and finally landing on her. For a brief second, she could almost feel them sizing her up, evaluating her, judging her, as if her worth could be measured by how she had responded to the situation. The person didn't know what it had taken for her to stand there, to challenge the laughter, to find her voice. The silence stretched again, heavier now, and then the newcomer addressed the group with a kind of authority that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Perhaps we should all calm down and reconsider what's really going on here." It was a carefully chosen phrase, one that could have meant anything, but to her, it sounded like an attempt to brush the issue aside. An attempt to diffuse the raw emotion in the room, to reduce it to something manageable, something palatable. And that was the moment she realized the true danger. It wasn't just the people who had laughed at her, it wasn't just the silent bystanders. It was this person, someone with influence, someone who could easily sway the situation back in favor of the very mindset that had led to her ridicule in the first place. Her heart thudded louder in her chest, the weight of her next words heavier than ever before. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It wasn't about making herself heard, or forcing them to acknowledge the truth. It was about something bigger. It was about the power dynamics at play, the way those in positions of influence could so easily sideline voices like hers, voices that were just trying to be seen, to be understood. But before she could react, the newcomer took another step forward, their gaze still fixed on her. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Let's all take a step back and talk this through." The calmness in their voice was almost too smooth, too practiced. She could feel the anger rising inside her, and with it, a sense of urgency. This wasn't just about standing her ground anymore, it was about protecting the space she had fought so hard to claim. She could feel the subtle shift happening as the room seemed to turn its focus on the newcomer. People were beginning to defer, slowly turning away from her, eyes flicking between the two of them. But she couldn't let this go. She wouldn't. Not when she was so close to something more. Something that could finally shift the dynamic. She wasn't going to let them sweep her anger, her story, under the rug with a few polite words and a smile. Her voice cut through the growing uncertainty. "No, it's not a misunderstanding," she said, each word clear, deliberate. "This isn't something that can be smoothed over with a simple conversation. It's about recognizing the harm, the damage, the years of things being ignored because it was easier that way. It's not a misunderstanding. It's a pattern." The newcomer's face hardened slightly, the facade of calm starting to crack. There was a flicker of annoyance behind their eyes, but they quickly masked it with an even tighter smile. You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. And just like that, it was clear. They weren't going to see her. They weren't going to understand her struggle. In fact, they didn't even want to engage in a real conversation about it. They were trying to make her the problem. Trying to make the real issue about her reaction, about her resistance, not the cruelty that had sparked it all. It was exactly what she had feared. The person with power who could have used their influence to help challenge the system, to stand up for what was right, was more interested in preserving the status quo than addressing the pain and injustice that had led to this moment. Her body tensed, every muscle screaming for action. This wasn't just about the room anymore. This was a turning point. A breaking point. The stakes had never been higher. The people around her were already starting to doubt. Some were shifting uncomfortably, others were watching with concern, unsure of what would happen next. Would the newcomer get the last word? Would the rest of the room retreat into silence once again, allowing the status quo to reassert itself? The room's atmosphere was shifting. Those who had laughed earlier were no longer so sure of themselves. They weren't laughing anymore. They were watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. And she could feel the eyes of the room back on her, but this time, it wasn't just about what she would say or do. It was about whether or not she would let this moment slip away. Whether or not she would let someone else control the narrative. Her hand clenched into a fist, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let anyone take this away from her, from everyone who had ever been ignored or silenced. But there was one question that lingered in the air: would anyone stand with her? Would anyone else see the truth, or would they all be content to watch her fight alone? Her heart raced, every nerve on edge as she stood at the precipice of something bigger than she could have imagined. The room felt like it was closing in on her. The newcomer was still there, trying to regain control, but she refused to back down. Every word she'd said, every action she'd taken, had brought her to this point. She wasn't about to let anyone take it away now. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point, and for the first time, the people who had once been passive observers were starting to stir. A few exchanged glances, whispering under their breath, unsure of how to navigate this sudden shift. But she could see it now. Something was happening. They were seeing her. Really seeing her. The harsh laughter that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by the weight of recognition. But the newcomer still wasn't done. "You're causing a scene," they said, their tone dripping with disdain, as though trying to belittle her once again. "This isn't the way to handle things." She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "You don't get to tell me how to handle my story," she said, her voice cutting through the air, firm and unwavering. "You don't get to silence me anymore." The room fell completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It felt like the entire world had paused, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, something unexpected happened. The person who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, the one who had been watching her, observing, but never once speaking, stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if they were making the conscious decision to step into the light. They weren't the most outspoken person, nor had they been a loud presence, but there was something about their stance now that commanded attention. They stepped forward, their eyes now locked on the newcomer. "Enough," they said, their voice steady and calm, but with an edge of finality that sent a ripple of surprise through the room. "You don't get to control this conversation. Not anymore." The newcomer faltered, their composure cracking for a split second. It was a subtle change, but it was there. They had not anticipated being challenged by this person, and it was clear in the brief flicker of uncertainty that crossed their face. But it wasn't just the newcomer who was taken aback. The room, once divided between passive onlookers and the few active voices, was now fully engaged. The power dynamics had shifted. One by one, people began to speak up. The ones who had been silent, who had sat by, letting things happen, watching the cruelty unfold, now found themselves questioning their own complicity. The atmosphere was changing, turning from one of tension to one of reckoning. She felt a flicker of hope in her chest, the weight of her fight beginning to feel lighter. It wasn't just her anymore. It was all of them together, finally. But then, just as she thought the storm had passed, another unexpected voice interrupted the growing momentum. The door swung open again, and in stepped someone else, a familiar face from her past, someone she had never imagined would show up here, not in a moment like this. Their presence in the doorway was like a punch to the gut. A sense of dread washed over her as she recognized who it was. They walked into the room with the same self-assuredness they had always carried, but now, it felt different. There was something off about their posture, something sharp in their eyes. This wasn't the person she had known before. This was someone else entirely. The room grew quiet again. The new arrival's gaze met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. They had known her well, once, and now their presence here was a wild card, a game changer that no one had seen coming. "I don't think any of you understand what's really going on here," they said, their voice cold, cutting through the air like a blade. The suddenness of their appearance, the intensity in their tone, sent a shockwave through the room. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the frustration of everything she had fought for suddenly at risk again. This wasn't supposed to be how it ended. She had been so close to breaking through, to changing the narrative, but now, with this person in the room, everything seemed uncertain again. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the unexpected visitor did something that completely threw everyone off balance. They turned to the newcomer, the one who had tried to take control, and said something so surprising, so contradictory to what they had expected, that the entire room fell into stunned silence. "I'm sorry," they said, their voice now softer, almost apologetic. "I didn't understand before. I see it now. You're right. This needs to be heard. All of it. The truth." The words landed with the weight of 1,000 bricks. She could feel the shift. The realization that the person who had once been a part of the oppressive cycle was now acknowledging the wrongness of it all. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. As the newcomer stepped back, the room held its breath. It was happening. People were beginning to understand. To realize that silence was complicity, and that standing by was just as harmful as being the one who had laughed. There was a spark, now small but undeniable. But just when she thought the weight of the moment was over, another twist came crashing into the scene. The person who had been silent throughout all of this, the one who had spoken up first, wasn't finished yet. They stepped forward again, but this time, their face held a different expression. It was no longer one of uncertainty, but of resolve. They turned to her and said, "I can't change what's happened, but I can stand with you now. And I'm not the only one." The room erupted into murmurs as others began to speak, their voices hesitant but gaining strength. Slowly, people were acknowledging the depth of what had occurred, realizing that the power in the room wasn't in the hands of one person, it was in the hands of everyone who chose to stand together. The newcomer, who had once tried to silence her, now looked on in disbelief. The cracks in their armor were widening, and for the first time, they seemed unsure of their place in this moment. And as the last wave of tension began to break, she realized something crucial. This wasn't about winning a fight or proving a point. This was about creating space for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every voice that had been laughed at, ignored, or dismissed. In the end, the unexpected twists had done what she couldn't have anticipated. They had brought out the truth, not just from her, but from everyone. And in that final moment, as the room fell into a strange, unified silence, she knew that this wasn't just the end of her story, it was the beginning of something bigger. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was all of theirs. The room was filled with a strange kind of stillness, a silence that had settled over everyone like a thick blanket. It wasn't the oppressive silence of tension, but a quiet filled with possibility, as if something profound had just happened, and no one quite knew how to react. Her breath slowed, the adrenaline that had fueled her fiery words and actions now ebbing away, leaving behind a sense of accomplishment. She had done it, she had finally broken through. But as the echoes of the moment faded, the weight of everything still pressed heavily on her chest. This wasn't a victory, not in the way most people would see it. There were no cheers, no applause. There was just a quiet, shared understanding that something fundamental had changed. The battle wasn't over, but it was a turning point, a moment when people, who had once been content to stay silent or stand by, began to question their own complicity. They had seen her. And in doing so, they had seen themselves. The newcomer, who had once been so certain of their power to control the room, was now visibly shaken. Their usual confident posture was nowhere to be found. Instead, they stood frozen, their eyes darting around the room, trying to process what had just unfolded. The shift in the room had been undeniable. It wasn't just her voice that had changed the tide, it was everyone's collective realization that things couldn't go on the way they had before. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt thick, and her heart beat loud in her chest as she tried to grasp what had just happened. Then, slowly, people began to move. One by one, they stood up, quietly but decisively. The room was no longer a place where silence reigned. It was now a place where voices could be heard, where the tension and the injustice of the past could finally be acknowledged. The person who had stood with her earlier stepped forward again, their presence now stronger, more confident. "We're not going to stand by anymore," they said, their voice clear and resolute. "We're not going to let this happen again." Their words were simple, but they carried weight. And in that moment, it wasn't just a personal victory for her, it was a shared victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless, invisible, or dismissed. Her eyes scanned the room, catching the faces of those who had once been passive observers. Some of them were nodding, others were looking around as if seeing the room in a completely different light. It was clear that things had changed, and she could feel the energy in the air, the quiet, growing sense of unity. No one was willing to go back to the way things had been. They had all taken a step forward, together. But there was still work to be done. As much as she felt the shift, as much as the room had changed in that moment, she knew that the battle wasn't over. This wasn't some quick fix, some one-time conversation that could undo years of harm. There was still a long road ahead, and she was aware that not everyone would be on board. There would be resistance, there would be doubt, and there would be those who would try to revert to old patterns. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in that fight. It wasn't just her against the world anymore. She turned to face the newcomer once more, their earlier bravado now reduced to a mere shell of the confidence they had once projected. They were still trying to regain their composure, but the cracks in their facade were too wide to ignore. The tension was no longer just between her and them, it was between all of them. The group was no longer passive. It was active, and everyone now had a stake in what came next. The newcomer's voice wavered slightly as they spoke again, their tone softer, less authoritative. Maybe there's something to what you're saying," they muttered, almost as if they were trying to convince themselves. "Maybe we need to think about this differently." It wasn't an apology, but it was a shift, a crack in the armor that had been so carefully constructed. And that's when it hit her. This wasn't just about winning an argument. This wasn't about proving herself right or proving them wrong. It was about the beginning of a real conversation. A conversation that had never been allowed to happen before. A conversation that had been drowned out by laughter, by silence, by apathy. But now, it was happening. She took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she addressed the room. "This is just the start," she said, her voice strong, filled with conviction. We can't let this be a one-time thing. We can't let the pressure fade. This is about changing how we see each other, how we listen, how we act. We can make a difference, but it won't happen unless we keep fighting for it. The words hung in the air, echoing through the room as if everyone was finally waking up to the reality that they were no longer passive bystanders in someone else's story. They were part of this narrative now, and whether they liked it or not, they had a role to play. She knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks. There would be moments of doubt. But there was also something new now. There was a shared resolve, a collective understanding that things needed to change. And that, for her, was enough to carry on. As the room began to break into smaller groups, conversations started to spark up. People were talking to each other, really talking, sharing perspectives and experiences they had never voiced before. Some were apologizing for their past indifference. Others were confronting their own biases and questioning their own actions. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't a quick fix, but it was real. It was a shift. The newcomer lingered for a moment, still processing everything that had happened. But as they left the room, they said something that left a lasting impact. "I'll be back," they said, their voice quieter now, but with an undertone of sincerity. I think I need to learn more. I need to do better." And just like that, it was clear. This wasn't just a moment of confrontation. This was a catalyst for something deeper. For change. For growth. As the door closed behind them, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The battle wasn't over. It might never be over. But she had made her mark. And more importantly, she had ignited something in others. They were no longer spectators, they were participants in their own story. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She wasn't just fighting alone anymore. She had an army of voices behind her, voices that would continue to speak out, continue to challenge the status quo, and continue to fight for what was right. And as she walked out of that room, she knew that the world was different now. She had made sure of it. And no one could laugh her down again. Not ever.